I love my viewers. Most of my viewers. You're smart and funny, very kind with your thumbs up, and you're subscribing to my Patreon at patreon.com/Rebecca. But there are a few commenters I really can't stand. There's the porn bots, there's the misogynists, and there's the guy who reminded me that the Shroud of Turin is a thing. That's right. I'm talking about you, Pat the Planter. You suck. Okay, I'm just kidding. I don't really hate you, but I really did not know that the Shroud of Turin was still a thing, and I did not need to be reminded. If you're not familiar with the Shroud of Turin, just imagine this. You know that J.D. Vance couch fucking story from a few weeks back, the one that we all immediately knew was fake? What if in 700 years, a bunch of people were really invested on insisting that it's real? And when historians are like, hey, here's the mainstream press at the time saying that it's fake, the other guys, let's just call them the couch fuckers, they say, well, that was just political intrigue designed to install Trump and Vance as God emperors. And when the historians say, we read the book he wrote and it doesn't say anything in there about couch fucking, the couch fuckers reply, you read the only remaining printing of that book, which omitted the passage in question due to controversy. And then they go, where do you think all these J.D. Vance semen collection cups got all that jizz from? Because that future civilizations archaeologist uncovered a bunch of those J.D. Vance jizz cups after a volcano wiped out a Trump campaign rally stop. And the historians at that point will just throw their hands in the air because, human's gonna human. Anyway, that's basically what happened with the Shroud of Turin. The shroud itself is a 14.5-foot long or 4.4 meter long linen rag featuring the full body front and back of some guy. Many Christians believe that it is Jesus Christ's death shroud, the fabric Jesus was wrapped in after he was crucified, which the Bible says that he left behind after he rose from the tomb. The Bible does not say anything about him leaving behind a magical selfie, but honestly, the Bible doesn't mention half the shit Christians believe it does, so whatever, it doesn't matter. The reason why the shroud is back in the news now is because, as Pat the Planter noted, a bunch of mainstream media outlets like the Daily Mail, the New York Post, and the Independent are suddenly running stories about a new study that used X-rays to date the shroud to the time of Jesus. Before I get into the study, which is in fact 2 years old, let me just lay out what the couch fuckers are up against here. The very first time any historian can find any reference to the Shroud of Turin is in 1390 AD, when a French bishop wrote a letter to Anti-Pope Clement VII to tell him all about how his predecessor had found the man who forged the shroud and got him to confess, saying that he made it up as part of a scam to get religious pilgrims to pay him money to be healed by the fake religious relic. When the forger was exposed, he and his cohorts hid the shroud away for 34 years until the heat died down, at which point they tried it again at the time of the bishop writing this letter. The bishop wanted to be sure that the anti-pope knew not to fall for it because that would be embarrassing, and the anti-pope agreed. And to this day, the Catholic Church officially does not consider the Shroud of Turin to be actually Jesus's burial shroud. Now, I know what you're wondering right now. What the fuck is an anti-pope? Is that the mirror universe pope? Is it an evil pope? If the anti-pope and the pope touch, would it destroy the universe? And the answer to all of those questions is yes. You can trust me. I learned all about anti-popes in college when I took a history course called Heresy and Persecution, which ruled. Anyway, yes, the very first thing we ever learned about the Shroud of Turin is that it turns up for the first time 1,400 years after it was supposedly created, and everyone at the time knew that it was just a big old scam. Scam artists aren't so easily put off, though, as we can tell from the fact that the original guy that made up the Shroud of Turin hid it for over 30 years before trying the scam again. So this rag got passed around, its popularity grew, and occasionally experts would start weighing in. A handful of religious guys would look at it and go, oh, this is definitely how they wrapped Jesus up. And historians would say, actually, they always used strips and they wrapped the head separately, which, come to think of it, is exactly how it's described happening in the Bible. And the religious guys would be like, well, we didn't read that. But this is totally what Jesus looked like. And art historians would say, literally no human looks like this. This is just how medieval artists painted people. And the religious guys would go, well, this is definitely real blood, though. And then chemists would say, actually, these are two common artist pigments of the 14th century, red ochre and vermilion, with a collagen gelatin tempera binder. Oh, and not for nothing, but scientists also used radiocarbon dating on the shroud. All organic matter, plants and animals and you and me, contain radiocarbon or carbon-14. When we die, we stop exchanging radiocarbon with our environment, and the stuff that's left inside of us starts to decay at a very slow, very constant rate. Scientists can therefore figure out about how long it's been since we died by seeing how much radiocarbon is left. This works for anything that was alive in the past 50,000 years or so. In 1988, researchers carbon dated the shroud at 3 different labs. First, a lab in Tucson determined the shroud was 646 years old, plus or minus 31 years. Next, a lab at Oxford found the shroud was 750 years old, plus or minus 30 years. Finally, a lab in Zurich found that the shroud was 676 years old, plus or minus 24 years old. Taken together, they determined with 95% confidence that the Shroud of Turin was created sometime between 1262 and 1312 or 1353 and 1384 CE. Again, that letter from the bishop was written in 1390, 34 years after a man confessed to making the forgery, which would be 1356, smack dab in that later date range. So yeah, that's the evidence that this new study is up against. The one that the Independent says may show that the Shroud of Turin is truly the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So let's have a look at the study. X-ray dating of a Turin shroud's linen sample was published 2 years ago in Heritage, a journal with an impact factor of 1.7, which is not great. Impact factor is a flawed but convenient way to quickly see how reputable a journal might be. For instance, the impact factor of Nature, where that radiocarbon study was published, is 50.5. So we're in the ones with Heritage. Again, it's a flawed metric, but worth mentioning. One co-author of this study immediately rang a bell for me. Giulio Fanti is a name I recognize from this Chemistry World article I read during my research. Richard Corfield wrote back in 2013 that Fanti had recently used spectroscopic methods to test samples of the shroud taken in the 1970s. Fanti's results date the shroud to between 300 BC and AD 400, a 700-year interval that nevertheless brackets the death of Christ. Corfield goes on to note that experts were skeptical of Fanti's results, in part because his technique is not only new, but seems to have been devised specifically to address the issue of the Turin shroud. In short, the scientific cart seems to have been put in front of the methodological horse. That's important. Put a little pin in that. We're going to come back to it. Onto this study, the researchers used a brand new technique of using wide-angle X-ray scattering to detect the deterioration of the threads in order to date ancient textiles. This technique was previously shown to be accurate in a study published 4 years prior, also in Heritage, and also by the very same authors. In that study, they proved the X-ray technique was accurate by examining various textiles and comparing their findings to radiocarbon dating, and those dates matched. In this case, the X-ray technique most definitely did not match the radiocarbon dating, because obviously this team found that the shroud must have been made, about 2022 years ago-ish. But wait, it gets funnier. The researchers admit in their first paper and also in this one that this X-ray technique is only accurate if the textile in question has remained for the entirety of its life in a climate-controlled environment with a temperature between 20 and 22.5 degrees Celsius, which is 68 to 72.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relative humidity between 55 and 75%. So in order for this result to be accurate, the Shroud of Turin must have been kept in a climate-controlled environment for more than 2,000 years. Do they think that the Shroud of Turin was being held in, the Temple of the Sun with the Holy Grail for 2,000 years? Do they think that it only ended up at a church in Turin because Indiana Jones went there and correctly identified it amongst some old knight's cum rags? Look, it would be hard to believe any historical object was kept in such pristine conditions for so long. But we know for a fact that the Shroud of Turin was absolutely not. How can I be so sure? Well, to give you just one little example, it caught on fire in 1532. For another example, it was in another fire in 1997. It may have been through 3 fires in its known history. There is absolutely no way in hell that this thing made it through 2,000 years at room temperature. But like every other piece of evidence deluded believers cling to showing the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ, none of this matters. They'll grab a hold of this study like a life preserver or like a blankie. You know, somebody should make a Shroud of Turin comfort blankie. Did I just give away $1 million idea? Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.